with Margaret Spike from the U.S. Dairy Export Council as we talk dairy exports. Margaret, let's talk about South Korea. We're seeing a big growth there in statistics, and what's the reason for that?
Well, it's been a truly a growth market for U.S. dairy producers, especially during the past decade. But recently, the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen steady and very significant growth. You know, U.S. DEC, along with our U.S. dairy exporters, have been working together ever since the late 90s to really build this market. In fact, when we started working in that market and opened our office there in Seoul in the late 90s, there was very little dairy on the menu or in the diet. And that's completely changed. U.S. dairy exporters have been very committed to serving that market. They started off exporting cream cheese to that market that was used in the bakery sector, then continued to provide pizza cheese to be used by pizza chains and string cheese. And now, after about a decade worth of work that was supported by producers to gain greater markets for them, South Korea is now our number 2 cheese export market, but more interestingly, it's really neck and neck with Mexico, which is our number 1 market for U.S. cheese overseas. So really an interesting story, a culmination of many activities. And then also, as well, as I was mentioning, we now have a pending free trade agreement with South Korea that's now before Congress. Hopefully that will pass, and that will certainly give greater access to U.S. dairy producers for their products in South Korea.
Well, this is all being done without a free trade agreement, so I could imagine what the potential could be, huh?
That's right. Even without this free trade agreement, South Korea has been a good market for U.S. Dairy producers, especially during the last 3 to 5 years, growing from the decade. But with that free trade agreement, we expect it to grow even more. So the free trade agreement is important to us not only to build our sales, but it's also important to us to keep us competitive because our competitors overseas, such as Australia, New Zealand, the European Union, for example, started to implement its free trade agreement with South Korea this past July, and the Australians plan to finish up their talks on a free trade agreement at the end of this year, and then the New Zealanders are also working with the South Koreans on a free trade agreement. So it's important to increase our sales and our access to that South Korean market, but also important just to provide us a competitive advantage in a market where our competitors are putting in place free trade agreements as well.
How are we stacking up with Australia, New Zealand, and Europe when it comes to exports?
Well, we're doing pretty well, and we're working to increase our exports and make sure that they're consistent, that they don't dip in certain years, but that they provide consistent and strong markets for U.S. dairy producers. This year, for example, our exports during the first 7 months of this year represent about 13.1% of our total milk solids production. That compares with about 12.8 in all of 2010, and then I think 9.3 in 2009. So definitely seeing consistent markets there, that our industry and exporters are consistently serving those markets. One reason why they're doing so is that they're finding that these markets are very profitable commercial outlets for their products and for the products of U.S. dairy producers.
When we talk about a global recession, and I'm not sure if we are in a global recession, are we? I don't know. But how does exports work in that market?
Well, it's not a simplistic kind of thing. There are a lot of factors that come into play to impact our global markets. Certainly right now, customers, not just overseas, but within our domestic market, are tracking and following very closely global economic concerns, things that are happening in Europe, for example. But they're also looking at supplies coming on, milk production in New Zealand. Their production season just began, and they're off to a strong season. So there's a number of different factors. It's not just economic concerns. It's production coming online in New Zealand. That's expected to be up. But as well, customers around the world are looking at their inventories and kind of waiting to see when to buy, when's a good time to buy. So it's not just, in this kind of globalized marketplace, there's never just one factor that's driving something or that might be responsible for something, but really a collection of many different things.
Many, like you said, to remain competitive and to be in that fight for that piece of the pie.
Well, right, and maintaining our competitiveness is really important. That 13% of our production is going to export right now, export markets, and so those are important markets, important outlets for U.S. dairy producers, and so we as an industry really have to take the necessary steps to remain competitive. Do the marketing kind of promotions that we do through USDEC, through the checkoff, but also work separate from our checkoff activities, but also work as an industry to obtain passage of these beneficial free trade agreements. There's a lot of different things that we as an industry must do that are just really important to us staying in the ballgame and remaining competitive.
Well, a lot of hard work involved in that. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Margaret Spike from the U.S. Dairy Export Council. This DMI update brought to you by your Dairy Checkoff.